Growing up, I never truly understood the concept of family. My earliest memories are of Helen and Charles, the couple I called Mom and Dad, though they were technically my grandparents. They doted on me, filled my days with warmth, and made the world feel safe. I wasn't supposed to know how much of a burden I had been. Not at 5 years old, but life has a way of making the truth seep in, even when you're too young to grasp its full weight. You see, I was the result of an accident. My biological parents, Sarah and James, were just college kids when I came along. They had dreams, bright, ambitious ones, that didn't include a screaming baby. My existence shattered their plans, and even though I didn't ask to be born, I carried the invisible guilt of being the reason their lives didn't go the way they wanted. Helen and Charles stepped in immediately. They saw Sarah's reluctance and James's disinterest, and decided that I deserved better than being shuffled between two kids who couldn't be bothered to figure things out. So, for the first 5 years of my life, they became my parents in every way that mattered. Sarah and James were distant figures, occasional visitors who brought stiff smiles and uncomfortable hugs, like strangers trying to play house. But things changed when Helen and Charles started aging. Their health began to decline, and the weight of raising a child in their 60s became too much. That's when the cracks in the facade began to show. Conversations behind closed doors turned into arguments I wasn't meant to hear. The words, "she's their responsibility and they can't avoid it forever," stuck with me, even though I didn't fully understand them. One day, I was told I'd be moving in with Sarah and James. At 5, I couldn't comprehend the enormity of that shift, but I remember Helen's tearful goodbye and the way Charles's voice broke as he told me to be a good girl. I didn't understand why it felt like they were losing something more than just a houseguest. Life with Sarah and James was different, colder, harsher. Their home didn't have the same warmth, and I quickly learned that my presence wasn't welcomed. Sarah treated me like an inconvenience, her words sharp and her patience thin. James was barely there, both physically and emotionally. He worked long hours, and when he was home, he acted like I was part of the furniture, there, but unimportant. The first time I realized how unwanted I was came in small moments. Sarah's frustration boiled over during simple tasks like helping me with my shoes or preparing my meals. There were days when her anger made me shrink, her cold eyes drilling into me as if I were to blame for every hardship she faced. And then there was James, who seemed to vanish behind his newspaper or disappear into the garage whenever I was around. The silence hurt almost as much as Sarah's words. There was a brief flicker of hope during my 6th birthday. I had a health scare after drinking milk at school. It turned out I had a severe allergy, and the reaction was so bad that I ended up in the hospital. For a fleeting moment, Sarah seemed genuinely worried. She held my hand, stayed by my side, and even kissed my forehead. It felt like I had found a piece of the mother I'd always wanted. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Once I recovered, Sarah slipped back into her old ways, and James just kept being James. By the time I started 1st grade, I had learned to navigate their household like a minefield. I kept my head down, avoided drawing attention, and learned to expect little from the people who were supposed to care the most. Still, I held on to memories of Helen and Charles, replaying their kindness in my mind whenever the nights felt too heavy. I told myself that if I could survive here, maybe I could find my way back to a place where I mattered. It's strange looking back on those early years. At the time, I didn't have the words to explain how it felt to grow up in the shadow of resentment. But even then, I knew I wasn't truly wanted. And that's a lesson you never really unlearn. It follows you, shaping the way you see yourself and the world around you. It's a weight you carry, long after you've left the house where it all began. By the time I turned 16, life with Sarah and James had settled into a rhythm, albeit an unpleasant one. They kept their distance, and I did my best to fade into the background. But something shifted the summer Helen visited. Her health had worsened over the years, and she struggled with the simplest of tasks, yet she always had a spark of determination in her eyes. On that visit, she introduced me to crocheting, calling it a craft of patience and persistence. It didn't take long for me to get hooked. At first, I fumbled. My stitches were uneven, my pattern sloppy, but Helen encouraged me with a tenderness I'd sorely missed. She taught me to see beauty in imperfection, to find solace in the rhythm of yarn passing through my fingers. It became my escape from the icy walls of Sarah and James's house. In the quiet hours, while the world outside slept, I'd sit in my room, crocheting until my hands ached and my mind felt lighter. What started as a hobby soon turned into something more. Helen suggested I try selling some of my creations, simple scarves and hats, to her friends. I wasn't sure anyone would want them, but the response was overwhelming. People adored my work, praising the intricate designs and craftsmanship. Orders began pouring in, and for the first time, I felt like I had something that was mine, a talent, a passion, and a way to carve out a future beyond Sarah and James's oppressive grasp. Helen helped me set up an online store, guiding me through every step with her characteristic patience. The money started trickling in, then pouring, more than I'd ever imagined. I could barely keep up with the demand. Late nights and early mornings became my norm, but I didn't mind. Every dollar I earned felt like a step toward freedom, a life where I could finally breathe without Sarah's cutting remarks or James's indifference. But secrets have a way of slipping out. Sarah stumbled across a package I'd been preparing to ship and demanded an explanation. When I told her about my business, her reaction was immediate and predictable. She didn't care about my success or the joy I'd found in crocheting. All she saw was money she believed she was entitled to as my mother. James chimed in with his usual apathy, but his words stung nonetheless. They both insisted I hand over my earnings, claiming it was their right as my parents to manage my finances. For the first time in my life, I said no. The word felt foreign on my tongue, but liberating in a way I couldn't describe. Their faces twisted in disbelief, then anger. Sarah's voice rose to a pitch that rattled the walls, accusing me of being ungrateful, selfish, and disrespectful. James's threat to destroy my work was the final blow. I knew then that my passion, my livelihood, was something they'd never understand or support. Sarah's retaliation was swift and cruel. She banned me from visiting Helen, cutting off the one person who'd always been in my corner. The ache of that loss was sharper than I'd anticipated, but it only strengthened my resolve. If they thought they could snuff out my light, they were sorely mistaken. With Helen's discreet help, I devised a plan. She acted as my silent partner, handling orders and shipments from her home while I continued creating in secret. I lied to Sarah and James about my whereabouts, claiming I was studying at the library or helping a friend. In reality, I was at Helen's house, soaking in her wisdom and fighting to keep my dream alive. Every time I handed over a new batch of creations, Helen would smile with pride, her frail hands brushing mine in silent encouragement. It was our shared rebellion, a quiet act of defiance against the people who'd tried to control my life. The risk was always there, looming like a shadow, but the thought of giving up was more terrifying than the consequences of being caught. I often wondered if they'd ever see me for who I was, not as an extension of their failed dreams, or a means to an end. But as I folded the last scarf of the night, the answer became clear. I didn't need their approval or understanding. I had found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, a spark of independence, and the unwavering support of the woman who'd always believed in me. That was enough to keep me going. As my skills grew, so did my resolve to escape the suffocating grip of Sarah and James. With Helen's unwavering support, I began to expand my business beyond her circle of friends. Social media became my new frontier. Late at night, with my door locked and my heart pounding, I created accounts to showcase my work. Photos of intricate scarves, delicate shawls, and custom hats quickly garnered attention, and orders began streaming in from places I'd only read about in books. Helen and I opened a joint bank account in her name to keep my earnings safe from Sarah and James. Every dollar I earned felt like a brick in the foundation of a future I was building for myself. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. I knew the risks, knew that if Sarah ever found out, the fallout would be catastrophic, but the alternative was unthinkable. I couldn't let them take away the one thing that gave me a sense of control over my life. That sense of control was shattered one afternoon when Sarah barged into my room unannounced. My laptop was open on my bed, the screen displaying a flurry of messages from potential customers. Her eyes darted across the screen, her face contorting with a mix of anger and disbelief. The confrontation that followed was one of the worst I'd ever endured. She accused me of deception, dishonesty, and disrespect, her voice growing louder with each accusation. James, as usual, stood silently in the background, his indifference cutting deeper than her words. The aftermath was brutal. Sarah imposed stricter rules, monitoring my every move and forbidding me from using the internet unless supervised. She even installed locks on cabinets and drawers, as if my yarn and hooks were contraband. Every moment at home felt like a battle for my sanity. But even under their watchful eyes, I found ways to fight back. I'd scribble designs in the margins of my school notebooks, crochet in the bathroom when no one was around, and smuggle finished pieces to Helen during our rare, covert meetings. School became my sanctuary. I poured myself into my studies, determined to excel in every subject. The idea of college, a place far away from Sarah and James, became my lifeline. My teachers noticed my dedication, and soon opportunities began to emerge. By the time I was 16 and a half, I had secured a scholarship to a prestigious university. It was my golden ticket, a chance to start over and leave the chaos of my home life behind. But there was one last hurdle to overcome. The night before my 17th birthday, I made the decision to leave. It wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of months of planning. Helen and I had mapped out every detail. I'd pack only what was mine, the clothes I'd bought with my own money, my crochet tools, and my finished pieces. Anything Sarah and James had provided would stay behind, ensuring they couldn't claim ownership over my new life. The hours leading up to my departure were agonizing. I moved through the house like a ghost, every creak of the floorboards setting my nerves on edge. When midnight struck, I slipped out of the back door with a single suitcase and a heart pounding like a drum. Helen was waiting for me in her car, her frail frame illuminated by the glow of the dashboard light. The moment I saw her, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of what I was leaving behind. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back. The house that had been my prison for so many years faded into the distance, replaced by the promise of freedom. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was steering my own ship, charting a course toward a future I'd built with my own hands. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine, and that was enough. Moving into Helen's house felt like stepping into a sanctuary. The air was lighter, the walls brighter, and for the first time, I could breathe without the weight of Sarah and James pressing down on me. Helen and I worked together to transform her small sewing room into my makeshift studio. It wasn't much, just a folding table, a lamp, and shelves crammed with yarn, but it was mine. It was a space where my creativity could flourish without fear of judgment or interference. With Helen's encouragement, I reactivated my online store. Orders picked up almost immediately, and soon I was busier than ever. My designs had evolved, and customers noticed. Social media became my lifeline, connecting me with people who valued my work and shared my passion. Each sale felt like a step further away from the life I'd left behind, and I threw myself into my business with a fervor I hadn't known I was capable of. Back at Sarah and James's house, my departure had caused an unexpected stir. I learned through whispers and indirect messages that they had thrown a celebration the weekend after I left. It wasn't a party for me. It was a relief for them. They framed it as a fresh start, free from the burden of raising an ungrateful child. The knowledge stung, but it also validated my decision. If they could let go so easily, then so could I. Helen was my rock during those early weeks of freedom, but she wasn't the only one who stepped up. News of my departure had spread through the family, and it didn't take long for James's parents to reach out. Until then, they'd been distant figures in my life, their interactions with me mediated by Sarah and James. But when they heard about the abuse and neglect I'd endured, something shifted. Their voices on the phone were laced with shock and guilt, and they promised to do whatever they could to make up for lost time. Meeting them in person was an odd experience. They were kind, attentive, and far more generous than I'd expected. They showered me with praise for my business and even placed a large order to show their support. Over dinner, they apologized for not intervening sooner and promised to be there for me going forward. It was a strange blend of comfort and awkwardness, but I appreciated their sincerity. For the first time, I felt like I had family members who saw me for who I was, not as an obligation or a source of income. Their involvement didn't go unnoticed. Sarah's resentment grew, and James's silence became even more pronounced. They tried to spin the narrative, claiming I was manipulating the family for sympathy, but their accusations fell flat. Relatives who had once sided with them began to question their actions. The tide was turning, and it was turning in my favor. With my growing support network, my business thrived. Friends of Helen's friends became loyal customers, and their recommendations brought in more orders than I could handle alone. Helen suggested I hire help, but the thought of sharing my work with someone else felt daunting. Instead, I doubled down, balancing my time between crocheting, managing the business, and preparing for college. The workload was intense, but it was fulfilling in a way that nothing else had ever been. The most surprising development came when a distant cousin reached out to me. She'd heard about my story through the family grapevine and wanted to feature my work in a local art show. It was an opportunity one couldn't pass up, and Helen beamed with pride as we prepared for the event. The show was a resounding success, cementing my reputation as a rising talent in the craft community. Every victory felt like a step further away from Sarah and James's shadow. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. With Helen by my side and a growing circle of supporters, I finally felt like I had a future worth fighting for. The scars of my past hadn't faded, but they no longer defined me. I was carving out a new identity, one stitch at a time, and the possibilities felt endless. The turning point came unexpectedly. A local journalist, captivated by my story and my intricate crochet designs, reached out for an interview. I hesitated, unsure if stepping into the spotlight was wise, but Helen encouraged me. She reminded me that sharing my journey could inspire others. The interview went live a week later, complete with photos of my creations and the modest studio we had pieced together in her house. I wasn't prepared for what followed. Orders flooded in, overwhelming my online store. Emails from strangers poured into my inbox, each one praising my work and sharing how my story had resonated with them. Some called me brave for pursuing my passion despite my circumstances. Others simply wanted to support a young entrepreneur. For the first time, I felt seen, not as a burden or a disappointment, but as someone capable of making a difference. The media attention, however, brought unwanted eyes. Sarah and James, ever opportunistic, reappeared with demands. They claimed that my success was built on their sacrifices and insisted they deserved public credit and a share of my earnings. Their words, relayed through hateful messages, were laced with entitlement and threats. They even hinted at legal action, framing their demands as parental rights. But Helen was ready. She kept meticulous records of my earnings, the joint bank account, and every expense we had covered ourselves. Her determination to protect me was unshakable, and her quiet strength gave me the courage to face the storm. The final blow came during a celebratory event I organized to thank my supporters. It was a modest gathering, hosted at a community center with handmade decorations and a display of my work. Friends, customers, and even distant relatives attended, their warmth and encouragement fueling my resolve. The event was a success, but it didn't escape Sarah and James's notice. They bombarded me with hateful messages, accusing me of flaunting my independence and disrespecting them. I had reached my limit. That night, I sat down and wrote an email to Sarah and James. I poured every ounce of pain, anger, and clarity into those words, explaining why I was cutting ties. I outlined the years of neglect and mistreatment, the countless times I had been made to feel like a burden, and the resilience it took to build a life they had no part in supporting. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I also didn't write out of spite. It was an act of self-preservation, a way to close a chapter that had weighed me down for far too long. Once the email was sent, I blocked all forms of contact. Their voices, once a constant presence in my life, were silenced. The relief was immediate, though not without a tinge of sadness. Cutting ties with one's parents isn't easy, no matter how justified the decision may be. But I knew it was necessary. I couldn't thrive while dragging the weight of their toxicity behind me. Helen and my paternal grandparents rallied around me, their support unwavering. They helped me prepare for college, covering expenses I hadn't managed to save for, and ensuring I had everything I needed for the next chapter of my life. Their kindness reminded me that family isn't defined by blood, but by love and actions. They were my true family, the ones who had stepped up when it mattered most. As I packed my bags for college, I felt a mix of emotions. The scars of my past hadn't faded, but they no longer held me back. My business continued to flourish, fueled by the momentum of the media coverage and the loyal customers I'd gained along the way. And while the future was uncertain, it was also filled with possibility. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was moving forward one stitch at a time. College was everything I hoped it would be, and more. The freedom to live on my terms was exhilarating, and I threw myself into my studies with the same determination that had built my business. My crocheting continued to flourish, and between classes and homework, I spent hours working on custom orders and expanding my designs. Balancing it all wasn't easy, but the challenges felt like opportunities, not obstacles. Nathan came into my life unexpectedly. We met in one of my early lectures, his easygoing nature a stark contrast to my own intensity. At first, I was hesitant to let anyone get too close. The wounds from my past were still tender. But Nathan's patience and kindness broke down my walls. He became my anchor in a way I hadn't experienced before, offering support without smothering and understanding without judgment. Our relationship grew slowly, each moment building trust and connection. For the first time, I felt what it was like to be valued for who I was, not for what I could offer. Back home, the ripples of my departure hadn't entirely faded. Sarah and James faced mounting social scrutiny after my story gained traction. Friends and relatives who once turned a blind eye to their behavior began to distance themselves. The pressure eventually became too much for them, and they left the country, citing a need for a fresh start. Their departure felt like the final severing of a toxic thread that had long tangled my life. Knowing they were gone brought an unexpected sense of closure, even though I hadn't needed it to move forward. Helen, as always, remained my greatest champion. She called often, eager to hear about my classes, my business, and Nathan. Her health was still fragile, but her spirit was as strong as ever. She reveled in my successes, taking pride in every milestone I reached. My paternal grandparents were equally supportive, their involvement in my life deepening with each passing month. They had become a second pillar of stability, their love filling a void I hadn't realized was still there. Reflecting on the past, I often marveled at how far I'd come. The girl who once felt like a burden, trapped in a house filled with resentment, was now thriving. My business had become more than just a source of income. It was a testament to my resilience and creativity. College opened doors I never thought I'd walk through, and my relationships with Nathan, Helen, and my newfound family were a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. If there's one thing my journey has taught me, it's the importance of surrounding yourself with the right people. Toxicity can suffocate, but love and support have the power to heal. Finding my passion in crocheting wasn't just about creating something beautiful. It was about reclaiming my identity and proving to myself that I was capable of more than surviving. The road wasn't easy, and there were moments when giving up seemed like the simplest option. But every setback, every harsh word, and every obstacle only fueled my determination. Leaving Sarah and James wasn't just about escaping their control. It was about choosing myself. That decision changed everything. As I looked around my small dorm room, filled with yarn and memories of late-night study sessions, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Helen, who never stopped believing in me, for my grandparents, who stepped in when I needed them most, and for Nathan, who showed me what it meant to be loved unconditionally. Most of all, I felt gratitude for the younger version of myself who had the courage to dream of a better life and the tenacity to make it happen. The story I've shared isn't just about overcoming adversity. It's about discovering who you are, finding the people who lift you up, and embracing the possibilities that come when you let go of what holds you back. The future is still unwritten, but for the first time, I'm excited to see where it takes me. Because now I know it's mine to shape.